Good morning, everybody. I'm very pleased indeed to welcome you to the launch of Every Village, Every Hour, a new and exciting piece of research from CPRE. I'm Crispin Truman, I'm the Chief Executive of CPRE, and I'm sitting in our London office. I think there's one other person here, so it's a very surreal environment. I hope you've been hearing about our launch report, which has been much trailed in mainstream press, and we've got an exciting lineup of people to talk to you about it today. I don't know about you, but I really love buses. I'm actually a London resident, so you might think, well, what's that got to do with rural areas? Well, I've actually lived through investment in buses in London, seen how people come, going through a period when buses were unreliable and very little used, and a huge investment a few years ago, which just turned around ridership in London. And there's a lot of evidence to back that up. But you don't have to believe me, because we've got with us a real life rural resident, Lloyd today, who's going to be talking to you as well. But I also love buses when I visit the countryside. Again, I don't know about you, but when I visit the countryside as a town dweller, I feel a little bit like a tourist. But if you use the local services, if you become part of what other people are using locally, it gives you a better experience. They're more reliable, they're a great opportunity to see around the countryside, and of course they're pretty cheap relative to other forms of transport. But that engaging with local area and the local services feels to me like a qualitative difference. And it's a really exciting time for buses, particularly not just with our research coming out, although of course that's pretty mega, but it's hot on the heels of the government's own new national bus strategy, which saw a commitment by the Prime Minister to level up bus services in rural areas. And I particularly like Boris's phrase that buses are a lifeline and a liberator. I have to say I fully agree with him on that. And so to talk about that, I'm very pleased indeed also to welcome today the Transport Minister, Baroness Vere. We're very grateful to the Minister for giving up her time today to say a few words and to answer your questions. We're also delighted to be joined by the Vice Chair of the National Federation of Women's Institutes, Anne Jones, as well as our own Transport Policy Campaign Officer expert, Chris Hinchliff. I want to give a big thanks to Transport for Quality of Life and the Foundation for Integrated Transport for supporting and helping us do this research, and to the wonderful Joseph Rowntree Charitable Trust for funding our campaign more broadly. It's great to see them here and so many more of you all, our key partners across the rural transport and rural sector, and of course MPs, peers, civil servants, councillors, journalists and many local CPRE activists and representatives with us this morning. I think this is testimony to the amount of passion and enthusiasm there is for improving rural public transport, and that's exactly what our research seeks to address. There will be a chance for Q&A at the end, so please feel free to start adding your questions to the box to the right of your screen. I've got something rather strange on my screen at the moment, Mark. I don't know what that is. Somebody's sharing. Yeah, I don't know what that is. Anyway, I'm sure it's going to be dealt with. That's probably where the video is going to pop up, but it's got some very strange top 10 Outlook tips on the right. Please include your full name and organisation so I can introduce you properly when putting your questions to the panel. You can also join the conversation publicly on Twitter. Use the hashtag rural buses. So why is this interesting to CPRE? Well, CPRE believes in a beautiful, thriving countryside that enhances all our lives. And we believe that part of that has to be living rural communities. The custodians of our countryside are rural communities, and we need to see sustainable communities and economies in rural life in the 21st century. And you can't have that without the services, the housing, and of course, the transport to make it all work. And that really includes, of course, looking at bus services. Comprehensive bus services are a vital part of rural transport. It's also a vital part of our response to the climate emergency. Let's not forget that the biggest contributor to carbon emissions in Britain today, and the only rising contributor now, is transport. We have to address the terrible problems of the climate emergency to which transport is contributing so massively, and in the countryside as well. So this is why last year we began our campaign to improve rural public transport, with the publication of our first Transport Deserts report with our friends at the Campaigns for Better Transport, which took stock of the state of rural communities' access to public transport. What we found won't surprise you, but was truly shocking. Over half of small towns in the southwest and northeast where we did our research were already transport deserts or at risk of becoming one, with absolutely minimal and totally unreliable levels of public transport, leaving people cut off, isolated and without the means to live an independent life. People living in rural towns and villages deserve better. Just to illustrate this, we're going to have a nice video clip, and I think that's what was on my screen earlier, so I hope I messed that up by mentioning it. So this clip's going to show us about the story of one of those people affected by living in a rural transport desert. So roll the film.
My name is Annie. I live in a beautiful rural hamlet in Northumberland. I've lived here for 10 years. I feel proud to call this place home. But there are no longer any bus services out here. My elderly neighbour has always been the heart of this community. But if you can't drive or cycle, you can easily end up housebound. At 80 years old, how can you make a 3-hour trip on foot to buy milk, visit your doctor, catch up with old friends? In these difficult times, a local bus service is a way out of isolation. That's what we all deserve.
Thank you very much. And I think you may well have spotted there that we have a celebrity in our midst. The star of that show, Annie Lloyd, is with us today, and we're going to be hearing from her in a very quick minute. So it's pretty dire out there. And what we seem to be saying in our modern day society is that if you're old, if you're young, or if you've got a low income, you can't live in rural areas. You've got to have a car. You've got to have multiple cars to live and access services and jobs and education in a rural area. Surely that cannot be right. The good news is there's a clear solution, and we're doing a lot of work on that. We've done a lot of research, and we're proud today to launch our vision for a reliable bus service for every community that takes Britain from trailing behind our European counterparts who do manage this to being ahead of them. And we've called it Every Village, Every Hour. This is a groundbreaking report based on modelling by Transport for Quality of Life and funded by the wonderful Foundation for Integrated Transport. And this sets out how we can have a bus network that truly meets the needs of rural communities. We're going to hear more about the report itself from our expert campaigner, Chris, in a minute. But first, I want to hand over to our celebrity star attendee and rural resident, Annie Lloyd, and her partner, Steve Lloyd. Annie, over to you.
Thank you very much, Crispin. Yes, I am the Annie in the cartoon, as you can probably see by the spectacles. Thank you very much for inviting us to paint a quick picture of what it's like to live in a rural transport desert, which of course is defined as an area not served by any kind of public transport. I think the last time a bus passed our door was in the 1960s. And that goes really for a good proportion of mid-Northumberland, which is where we live. In fact, the buses and trains that do run in our area all run north-south. There's just nothing running east-west at all.
Yes, we live 5 miles west of our local town, so we just can't get there by public transport to access services. Everyone drives, because if you can't drive, you can't live. It's as simple as that. In this and many other rural communities, it's too easy to become marginalised.
Yes, if you're old, or if you're young, or if you're suddenly unable to drive, or unable to afford a car, or perhaps need to have an old car mended, or just want to find more planet-friendly alternatives, you are unable to lead a full and independent life, really, because there just are no alternatives.
As you saw in the campaign video, an elderly neighbour of ours has been completely housebound since his sudden stroke. He's now entirely reliant on other people's goodwill or hospital transport to get him to medical appointments because his medical condition leaves him unable to drive. It's eroded his sense of independence and connectedness. In order to avoid a similar fate, many local people sell up their homes at the first sign of infirmity and move to a town, leaving friends and family and community just at the point that they need them most.
And the lack of a reliable bus service is not just impacting the elderly. I suddenly discovered that I needed a cardiac pacemaker in my 40s, which meant that I temporarily lost my driving licence. At that point, I was still a full-time school teacher, and I needed 2 months off until I could drive again. My neighbour, the same age, badly broke both of her arms in a riding accident, and the isolation that resulted led to a period of depression. Many people across the country at the moment are experiencing that sort of isolation due to the pandemic, of course. And sadly, for some of us in rural communities, this was already well known.
Even for able-bodied car owners, the current state of rural transport comes at a cost, both to the environment and to residents. It's not uncommon for families to have 3 or 4 cars on their drives, one for each adult member. Life is extremely car dependent. Rural carbon footprints are huge.
Some of our neighbours are young parents who feel like permanently overworked taxi drivers ferrying their offspring to local towns for evening activities, sometimes covering 50 miles in an evening as they sort of travel from scouts to band practice to guides. And teenagers and young adults, of course, who would normally be afforded a degree of independence through a reliable bus service, struggle to get to school and to their activities and then later to college and to training.
Yeah, I've seen an impact on the local community and in terms of the economy. Sadly, the pubs have almost all closed. They're unable to find enough non-drinkers to sustain them, or
non-drivers.
What did I say? Non-drinkers.
Non-drinkers.
Yeah, I probably need.
It's probably both.
Yeah. And of course, not enough young people to staff them. Not able to get there. Local jobs, shops and businesses go under too, because locals may well jump into their cars to drive to town, even if it's a 20-mile round trip.
Yeah. So these days I have an e-bike and I commute 20 miles a day on that, but it's only a partial solution. You know, the winter's very long up here, the potholes are terrible, and the ice can be treacherous. So it's a partial solution. It's definitely a step in the right direction. I love my e-bike, but it's not for everybody and it's not for all of the time. A regular bus service would connect everybody truly in our community. It would be a great leveller. We could really do things. We could go places, projects, interests, systems, businesses. It would mean everybody could participate. It would just unleash a whole new energy and really catalyse local business, I think. Anyway, we're really pleased to see the Minister for Buses here this morning, and we are really hopeful that this is an issue that will be prioritised. So thank you for listening. We really appreciate this opportunity to share something of our rural realities, and thank you. And back to Crispin.
We've been doing this IT thing for every year, haven't we? And I still left myself muted. Can you believe that? Thank you very much, Annie and Steve. And that's given us a really good taste from the front line of the devastating effect that our complacency about rural transport has. And that complacency, of course, not only affects public people in rural areas dramatically, as you've described, but also, as you've alluded to the environment, the congestion, the pollution, our high streets in market towns and villages cluttered and congested with cars and pollution, microplastics from tyres, a lot of hidden pollution we don't know about, and of course noise. It's walking in the countryside, it's never long before you hear the roar of a road interrupting the peace and quiet. And we hear about wildlife effects, the bird song being interrupted by road noise, the litter we can all see. So this is a huge problem. Dependence on cars not only affects people, but the environment and the countryside. So we've got to do something about it. And here to tell us what the solution looks like is our expert campaigner, Chris Hinchliff. Over to you, Chris.
Thanks, Crispin. What we've just heard from Annie shows why the bus network is so important to rural communities and really emphasises why the benefits these services bring are potentially so vast. And while the social and economic case for rural bus services is powerful, the decarbonisation agenda makes them essential. The Transport Secretary has made it clear that delivering a net zero transport system means that we will have to use our cars much less. So, if we are to have a just transition, we must reverse the growth of public transport deserts across the countryside, which have left too many rural communities with virtually no alternative to driving for even the most basic journeys. No doubt, the Transport Secretary had this in mind when he wrote in the recently published National Bus Strategy that everyone deserves to have access to cheap, reliable and quick bus journeys. That's everyone without caveat or qualification. Years of cuts to rural bus services might make this appear unrealistic, but the evidence from our European neighbours shows that it can be done. A comprehensive bus network that connects rural villages and towns with larger urban centres is already happening elsewhere. It just requires the government to actually plan for it, rather than expecting solutions to appear magically through the invisible and ghostly hand of a deregulated market. We took the title of our report, Every Village, Every Hour, from the objectives that transport authorities in North Hesse in Germany have set themselves. And similar standards can be seen in the cantons of Switzerland, where villagers are guaranteed an at least hourly bus service from 6 AM to midnight, 7 days a week. CPRE's report shows how England too can have a bus network that delivers services to every village, every hour. With expert advice and peer review from across the sector, we've been able to model bringing this vision to the 24 million people living in rural areas and urban districts with a significant rural hinterland. Our groundbreaking model maps, measures and costs the bus kilometres needed to deliver every village, every hour services in a range of districts across England with varying topographies and levels of rurality. By then scaling up this analysis across similar districts, we've been able to estimate the cost of delivering this comprehensive service throughout England. Crucially, our research shows that an every village, every hour bus network can be easily funded. To deliver these services from 6 AM to midnight, 7 days a week on current fare rates would cost 2.7 billion per year. But of course, the government is now committed to ensuring bus services are also affordable. And our research shows that delivering the same services at a £1 flat fare would require an investment of 3 billion per year. And there are plenty of places the government can find this money. Redirecting the money due to be spent on environmentally damaging and deeply unpopular road building would provide £3.5 billion per year, enough to deliver a comprehensive every village, every hour bus network that is fare free. To ensure that public transport is a convenient alternative to driving a car, we need a system regulated by local transport authorities that can provide a guiding mind to the design of the network. We also need properly integrated bus and train timetables and ticketing to deliver the smooth cross-mode journeys so often spoken of. If levelling up is to mean anything, this is what it must look like: a universal basic right to public transport with reliable, convenient, affordable and at least hourly bus services for every community with more than 200 residents or so, and a safety net of demand-responsive transport connecting the smallest villages and hamlets to the network. With an every village, every hour service, we could level up rural communities and build a world-leading comprehensive bus network. The challenge for the government is now to match the ambition that we share for rural communities with the long-term funding necessary to make that vision a reality. Thank you. Crispin, back to you.
Thank you very much, Chris. I'm going to go straight over to our partner, Anne Jones, who is Vice Chair of the National Federation of Women's Institutes. We're working across the voluntary and community sector to promote this vision for rural life in the future. And it's not just those of us concerned with transport that realise the urgency and importance of this. So I'm very grateful to you, Anne, for coming and joining us today. It'd be great to hear from you about your perspective.
Good morning, and thank you, Crispin, for inviting us to be here today. The WI are very much involved with bus services, and we fully support the ambition of CPRE, and we hope that the discussions today will take us a step closer to achieving this. As some of you may know, we have a long history of delivering ambitious campaigns. These tackle some of the most challenging issues head-on. At the heart of all our campaigns are our 200,000 members who collectively take action on issues they care about and inspire others to do the same. Today I would like to give you a snapshot of how the WI is taking action through our Get On Board campaign, which launched in 2019. We'll also be publishing our report on local bus services in the coming weeks, and I'm pleased to be sharing a few of our top line findings with you today. The three key areas I will be looking at today are the environmental importance of bus services, accessibility of bus services, and the importance of integration of buses with other transport networks, and the impacts on both rural and urban areas in this. So if we start with the environment, in order to achieve net zero carbon emissions by 2050, a modal shift is required to encourage and enable more people to use public transport and decrease dependency on our cars, once restrictions ease, of course, and it is safe to do so. As a result of reductions to local bus services, our report found that 50% of all respondents said that dependency on travelling by car had increased. I think it's increased even more now in this pandemic. We also received many comments from residents in rural areas explaining that due to a lack of bus service, there was no alternative to using a car. And an increase in the use of public transport and a reduction in the dependency on cars can also have far-reaching effects on microplastics pollution, as Crispin alluded to. Our data shows that environmental consciousness is shaping travel behaviour, as 51% of all our respondents said that the main reasons for using the bus was environmental. When asked, would you use the car less if you had access to a frequent and reliable bus service, 50% of all respondents said yes. And that's quite a shift these days. So next, looking at the accessibility of bus service and its impacts. We all know that bus services play a vital role in ensuring communities remain sustainable, helping to reduce social isolation and ensure access to employment, education, local facilities and health services. On research and that of others highlights the consequences of this, such as difficulties accessing key services, employment opportunities and increased isolation, and the need to ensure access to reliable and frequent bus services consistently across England and Wales. And I think the key word there is consistently. Currently, bus services in many rural areas are infrequent and unreliable. Out of the total respondents to our survey who told us they live in a rural area, only 18% said they had access to a frequent, reliable bus service, compared with 50% in non-rural areas. So there's quite a difference there. We know that buses provide a lifeline to those in rural areas without ready access to a car, and where access to basic services is only possible through public transport. For this reason, we need to ensure a minimum frequency of bus services for towns and rural areas. And the survey also included 195 comments from respondents explaining that they had no evening bus services. Crucially, residents in these areas are being denied access to key services and opportunities as a result. So finally, moving on to integration with other transport networks, bus services play a vital role ensuring residents have access to other transport options. And 30% of all respondents said they use the bus to access other transport services. However, bus services in rural areas in particular are not adequately integrated with other transport services. 13% of those living in rural areas said bus services are not integrated with other transport services, compared with just 7% from non-rural areas. So a late bus had impacted their connection to other transport services, and they would use the bus more frequently if bus services were integrated with other transport services. So to conclude, we will be publishing our report in the coming weeks, and if you would like a copy of it, it will be available on the NFWI website, or you can email pa@nfwi.org.uk. In the coming months, we will also be looking to encourage members to join these discussions in their local areas to ensure their views are heard. WI members are extremely passionate about the environment, so when it's safe to do so, we will be encouraging them to get back on board to ensure that our bus service is fit for purpose, both in rural areas as well as our towns and cities. So thank you very much, and we can return to Crispin now.
Thank you very much indeed, Anne. It's great to have the support of the Women's Institutes and to have those wider points made, because of course our bus policy campaign is part of a wider vision for rural transport, which does see integration across the modes. Really important point there to be made. So let's move straight on to our speaker from the government. So big welcome, thank you very much for joining us, to Baroness Vere of Norbiton, who is the Transport Minister for Buses, who's going to talk about the new National Bus Strategy, and I hope how that's a springboard for great things for buses in rural areas in the future. Welcome, Minister.
Thank you very much. I think I just gave the organisers a great big fright there as my internet died and I dropped off. But never mind, I'm back, which is marvellous. So thank you so much for inviting me to speak to you today, and of course thank you. You're muted, Baroness. You're muted, Baroness. You're not. Oh, good. Sorry. Hang on. Well, I'll mute myself and unmute. Wait. Unmute. Am I back now? I can hear you. Sorry, the sign says you are, but can everyone hear? Minister, yes. OK, apologies. Carry on, please. This is going very well, isn't it?
Very strange.
Right. Let's try again, shall we? So, of course, and thank you to CPRE for the work that they're doing on this, obviously culminating in today's report. And I think we've all been aware for quite some time that there is a huge gulf between rural and urban areas when it comes to buses. As so many of the speakers have outlined, often the only way to travel is by bus. I'm getting lots of things saying that I'm muted. Am I really muted or not? I'm going to carry on regardless until you tell me.
I can hear you.
Okay. So basically, we need a regular and reliable network. We know that. It's absolutely crucial to get people to work, to get people to school, to get people to college, to get them to access healthcare and their local high street. And of course, for too long, and this is the case for successive governments, that we have failed to invest in buses, and the consequences have been most stark in rural areas. So last week, you will have seen the government launched the first ever for a very, very long time, decades, I think, national bus strategy. And that comes with 3 billion of new funding. And as importantly, the biggest shake-up to buses for generations. So I'd like to focus on how the strategy will help rural areas. First, and most importantly, it will increase local accountability, giving local councils greater responsibility over local bus services. So we're building on what's worked really well during the pandemic. So bus operators and local councils have worked together to keep services running and to keep key workers moving, getting to where they needed to be. So what we've said is by the 30th of June, we expect every local authority and every bus operator to commit to entering a formal statutory arrangement. So this is either something called a statutory enhanced partnership or a franchising arrangement. Basically, it sets out the rules by which everyone will work together to make the network as good as it can be. So you'll have certainty for the bus operators, so they will be able to invest and innovate with confidence, but also councils will have much greater control over local routes, over fares, on traffic enforcement, on congestion, all sorts of different things. And we recognise that local councils have been very busy. They can be overstretched. So we're putting in £25 million to recruit the sorts of experts and officials that they need to make sure that these partnerships actually work. And I think that, it's really important that we say that any future funding is absolutely dependent on councils doing this work first. So underpinning the National Bus Strategy is this very simple idea that local leaders in local government understand the best needs of their local and particularly rural today communities. They understand it far more than central government in Westminster is ever going to be able to do. So government provides the cash services, but local councils will be able to cash support, but local councils will have to plan for the services and deliver them as they see fit. So what local councils will do is they will publish bus improvement plans, and in those plans there will be published targets so local people can hold local councils to account, and those plans will set out how they will improve the passenger experience in rural areas. And of course, this will all be done. Local councils are expected to work with bus advisory boards. This would be made up of local activists like Annie and other people who've got an interest in how the local bus services are working. That might be businesses, it might be providers of local services, it might be disability groups, all sorts of people will be able to input. And we're also supporting local leaders with a bus centre of excellence so that they can share their learning, because there's a lot of catching up, I think, for local authorities to do. So the second big benefit is the daily passenger experience, as I think some people have set out, have noted in our bus strategy. We want more modern buses, we want disability friendly buses, we want more information, we want cheaper fares, higher frequencies. Like, for example, ending this bizarre situation that in some areas the local bus operators simply don't recognise each other. Well, that's just mad. And also what we did, you will have seen that we've invested £20 million from the Rural Mobility Fund to do some pilots, 17 pilots across the country on demand responsive transport to test how these might work, particularly in rural locations. So with the touch of a smartphone, a minibus will come and pick you up nearer your home and at a more convenient time. So you wouldn't have to necessarily wait around for an hour or more for your bus to turn up. Of course, we're going to be looking at safety, particularly in the light of some concerns recently about the safety of women. We will have onboard CCTV and also, much better bus stops with information. And finally, a number of speakers have mentioned the environment, and of course this is really, really important. We need to break the self-perpetuating cycle of, as bus use declines, more people use cars, they cause greater congestion in local towns, and then you get a slower and more inefficient bus service, so you get more cars, and of course that increases pollution, and of course increases our carbon footprint. So we need to really think very carefully about the sorts of vehicles we have driving our roads, and how effective they are at getting people to move around. So, I mean, for example, the Harrogate Bus Company's number 36 service to Leeds. My mother absolutely loves it, and it is high frequency on that particular bus corridor. There are routes which lead into the number 36 from local villages, and it's a really, really successful service. So I think we can do an awful lot more in terms of making sure that bus use is sustainable, and it leads us to modal switch away from cars. But just briefly before I finish, we've got to recognise that the bus industry has had an incredible 12 months, and incredible not in a good way. Sometimes bus use is down to about 10% of what it would normally be. And we have invested £1 billion in supporting all of the buses across the country so that they can continue to run. And my thanks to the thousands of bus drivers and everyone else who works in the industry, because they've kept the country moving, and it's been really important to have them there. So to sum up, I think the success of the strategy depends on bus levels returning to and then exceeding pre-COVID levels. We need to be able to convince people that you don't have to have a car to live in the countryside. And there are those who sometimes will say that we haven't gone far enough. And indeed, there's some who said that we haven't gone far enough without even having read the bus strategy. I'm looking at you, CPRE, for your comment before the bus strategy was even published. But I believe that this strategy is a game changer, because whether you live in rural Lincolnshire or central London, you should be able to access a modern, reliable and affordable bus service. So thank you very much for inviting me today.
Thank you very much indeed, Minister, and it is fantastic to have a Minister with such passion for buses, and great to hear you make reference to the fundamental tenets really of good bus services: reliability, frequency and affordable fares. You're completely right about that. I'm sure a lot of people in the audience will be delighted to hear that. But of course, the first question that will come up is about money, and it is great to see government committing this initial tranche of money to the National Bus Strategy, but the ongoing financing will be an issue. So our first question going to the audience is from David, and he asks, what assessment has the government made of what its current funding proposals as set out in the new strategy, which we have now read, Minister, I promise you. What assessment have you made in terms of what the funding will actually deliver against your own objective of everyone having access to cheap, reliable and quick bus journey? So is it enough money to deliver your vision?
Yes, we do. We feel that it is. But I mean, one of the things that we have to remember about the bus strategy, which I have to say has been a year in gestation, we have been trying to do it with the backdrop of obviously very challenging transport usage. And so we have had to intervene in the bus sector like never before in terms of supporting services. And now what the funding will now depend upon will be the scale of the ambition set out by local councils in their plans. So we will be, very clear, setting out the sorts of things that we want the local councils to focus on. We will be looking for bus priority measures, particularly in local towns where buses can get jammed up. But different councils will have different levels of ambition, but they'll also have different ideas as how to get there. Again, this is not national government saying we want exactly this in exactly every single place in the country. That would be utterly wrong. But I would turn to, for example, Cornwall. Now, you mentioned that some of your research was done in the southwest, and I'd be interested to hear your observations on what you think the impact of what Cornwall's trying to achieve, because they have very, very ambitious plans for their buses. Obviously, they've been impacted over the last year, but we fully support them in what they're trying to achieve. And we will be looking to different areas. We'll try different things. Some things will work, some things won't. But that's why we have the Bus Centre of Excellence, so that people can share and say, we tried this, it worked, or it attracted more of this type of passenger onto the system. So I think it's really important that there's a great feeling of collaboration around this, and the funding will depend on the ambition that's set out by local authorities.
Yes, thank you very much. I think we have recognised the good practice example of Cornwall, which has been achieved in recent times. But I think the economics and the reason we spoke out early on when the bus strategy was arrived at is we do fear that the money isn't enough, certainly up front. What's very interesting when you read our report is the economics of it, because people might think, well, 2.7 billion a year, that's a lot of money, although of course it's not a lot of money compared to investments in roads, for example. But actually the economies of doing this properly in time are massive. You get people with a reliable regular bus service, you get people using it, you get the money coming back in. Then you get savings on things like NHS transport, of course, which we don't think about, all the other costs of not having a reliable public transport system. But it might be worth Chris having a word at this moment and talking particularly about the economic side.
Thanks, Crispin. Yeah, I mean, you're absolutely right. The potential economic benefits of a reliable and comprehensive bus network hugely outweigh the cost of investing in it. The savings to the NHS from reductions in air pollution, the benefits of reducing microplastic pollution, the reductions in lost time to traffic and congestion, the improvements in our health from walking to and from bus stops, and actually improvements to our mental health from more opportunities to socialise as well. So the potential benefits are vast and are not often taken into account. But as our report shows, what we really need to see is a long-term funding settlement. I think that the concerns that we have raised are in relation to seeing a single pot of money. What we need to see is ongoing funding to ensure that the money is there to deliver the reliable, cheap and convenient bus journeys that we're all agreeing we want to see. We need to make sure that that funding is there on an ongoing basis and avoid going back to the system where it was left to what was commercially viable to determine what services different communities received.
Thank you very much. But moving on to a couple of other topics now, and I'm going to batch up some of the questions here. Firstly, Bill Freeman from the Community Transport Association. This is a common question asked about this area. Is the role of community transport on demand responsive services? How important is it that their role is recognised and included in national bus strategy implementation and local bus service improvement plans? And I'm going to add to that, is there a risk that reliance on demand responsive actually might undermine regular routes, and that we need to get the right balance and make sure that both play their legitimate role in the solution? So let's go around the panel on that. And the second one, if you can hold this in your mind, it's a completely different question, but I'm going to plant it so we have more time, and that's about the carbon. This is probably one for you, Chris. Please explain the building blocks in the calculation of the predicted carbon emission savings from the Every Village, Every Hour bus network and the assumptions on which it's based. That's from our CPRE Kent chair, John Watton. So let's start with the community transport question. Let's go to Anne and Annie. Who wants to say something about that? And demand responsive.
Yes, I'll start on that if you like, Crispin.
Please.
I would say that on-demand buses have their place in this scheme, and they can be a useful part of it. But it's not to replace a proper regular bus service. It's almost a sticking plaster to address the issue, in that you could say, oh, you can ring up for a bus. Whereas if the bus service is there and is visible all the time, people are far more likely to make use of it rather than having to ring up for one and almost feel that they're being a nuisance, because as a society, we don't like to be a nuisance to other people. So that on-demand is part of a solution, but it isn't the main solution. The main solution is having a regular bus service that's reliable and accessible and not too expensive.
Thanks very much, Anne. Annie, any reflections on that?
Thank you. No, not really. It's just that to make the point that the transport sector currently accounts for the largest share of UK greenhouse gas emissions, and we've had more than one bus route being taken away from town and village residents like us every single day for the last 8 years. These some of this data is stark.
Thank you. Yes, there's a lot of ground to make up. Minister, do you want to add anything on those questions?
Well, I've always got lots to say on everything, so I'll try and be brief. On community transport, we absolutely recognise the important part that community transport can play. That's why on those who are operating under a Section 22 licence are getting CBSSG at the moment. Section 19 obviously can get funding from elsewhere, but we think that, again, it's down to local authorities to see what they've got in terms of community transport operators in their local area and use them. On demand responsive transport, I I think we need to think about this as an understanding issue. You know, if you had told me a little while ago that I would be literally able to get demand a taxi outside my house at any time of the day or night on my phone, I would have laughed. But I can. And I think the same thing goes for demand responsive transport. We have to think about how it's going to work, because one of the things that really worries me about the CPRE report is that it would be transporting an awful lot of fresh air around, an awful lot. And I'm worried about that from an environmental consideration and obviously from a financial consideration. So I think, you know, we do have to look at other solutions. And if some people feel that they are being a nuisance, we have to explain to them that they're not, that it's a service that's there to serve them. And they're definitely not being a nuisance because, you know, it would be there in 15, 20 minutes. So I think people need to, I think there's probably a tipping point that we're going through that will work its way through. And I hope that demand responsive transport will be successful. But if it's not, you know what, we have to keep trying, we have to keep looking at other innovations because obviously this is a problem that we do have to solve.
Thanks very much. I'm sure on the fresh air point, Chris will want to respond to that, but of course there's a hell of a lot of fresh air and there's millions and millions of cars with one person in them buzzing around the countryside at the moment. So, and I think the key point there is you build this and they will come, but as you say, Minister, that local authorities being able to respond to demand is also a key part of that picture. Chris, any reflections on that or the carbon question?
Thanks, Crispin. Yeah, lots to cover, so I'll try to keep it brief. I think the first thing to say is, you know, community transport services have done a wonderful job of helping rural communities over the last decades when we've had a really threadbare rural bus service. So I think it's really right that their contribution is recognised. In relation to demand responsive transport more widely, our report does recognise the role for demand responsive transport. It does exist in the best international examples of a comprehensive bus network. It's important for connecting the smallest communities and hamlets, which might not be appropriate for a regular bus service. And we do agree with the Minister that it's down to local authorities to decide the right size of vehicle for the services that they put on to meet the needs of rural communities. However, relating to the carbon point, actually, it's absolutely essential that we see transport carbon emissions fall. And in order to meet our net zero targets, we need to see traffic reductions in the order of 20 to 60% in the next decade. And the evidence shows that in order to achieve that, what we need is a reliable public transport alternative, and that demand responsive transport, while it has a role, doesn't lead to the modal shift that we need to see. And in relation to the Minister's point about air being transported around, the evidence, again, from places like Switzerland and Germany, where they do have a really comprehensive bus network, which consequently is really convenient to people and is a proper alternative to driving a car, they see 6 to 7 times more public transport trips per capita already than we have, and they are looking quite confidently to double that. So, as you said, Crispin, if we build this service, people will come, and if we make it truly reliable and convenient, it will be used much more efficiently than we end up in our slightly strange vicious cycle at the moment, where the bus services we do have are often so unreliable and inconvenient that they're used very rarely.
Thank you very much. We've got time for another couple of questions which I'll bunch together. They're quite different themes, but that keeps our brains active. So firstly, welcome to Ben Colson from the chair of the Bus Users Alliance, and he's asking about this point about local authorities knowing the needs of their residents and being put in the driving seat of the bus strategy, which of course we broadly welcome, but he's rightly pointing out that there are some local authorities that don't properly take account of the views of local bus users in setting up their bus improvement plans. So what will the government do about those recalcitrant local authorities that don't do the job properly? Will they not receive their full funding under the strategy? That's probably a question specifically for the Minister, but a slightly broader question from Ruth Bradshaw from our sister charity Campaign for National Parks is about how the government ensure the needs of visitors to national parks and other parts of the countryside are addressed as part of these proposals. In particular, how will they work with the national park authorities to make sure they're involved in development and implementation of bus service improvement plans where relevant? This is a really important question because the shocking statistic of visiting national parks is that 95% of visitors to national parks go in cars. That's clearly environmentally disastrous, but it's also very exclusive. So a broader question there on access to countryside national parks, and then one there around recalcitrant local authorities. Perhaps we could go around the panel and see if anyone has any reflections on particularly countryside national parks. Anne or Annie?
Yes, I'm happy to answer that. I agree entirely that we have to have a regular bus service, and this is where the connectivity is important, that bus services can connect with a service that's dedicated to take people to the national park, so that you have a joined up approach to it all. It is absolutely ludicrous that we're encouraging people to visit national parks, make the most of our wonderful landscape and environment, and yet we're destroying it by getting there in our cars. As you said, 95% is a staggering statistic. So this has to be one of the priorities, I would have thought.
Thank you. Annie, any reflections?
I would just say that a lot of the towns and villages at risk of becoming transport deserts in mid-Northumberland are sort of dotted around the Northumberland National Park. So yeah, certainly it's very, very poorly served at the moment. And yes, 95% car attendance doesn't surprise me. The other thing is we have a number of National Trust properties up here, and again, absolutely no bus service. So of course the car parks there are absolutely thronging on a nice day, because nobody, in fact, my mother used to volunteer at a National Trust property, and she lived to serve as a volunteer there, but she could not get there. And that really was a significant detriment to her emotional health and well-being and happiness.
Thank you. That's an interesting point there. And actually, of course, this isn't just about the government. This is about all of us working together to improve public transport and to use it. So I think as individuals, we need to make sure we use public transport in the countryside where it's there, because it does exist in some places. And also we need owners like the National Trust you mentioned and other heritage and visitor attraction sites to promote public transport where it's there. I quite often visit these sites and they don't mention a perfectly good bus route. They just talk about where the car park is. So we've got a shared agenda here. But Minister, any thoughts on any of these issues?
Yeah, absolutely, because I think it's a really important point about the national parks, and I think it's really beholden upon those people that run the national parks to really get involved with how bus services are going to be developed by the local authority. And I also think, and people mention sort of National Trust, and certainly we can look at how we involve people like that, or they are involved in the bus service improvement plans. I think they need to be a bit more innovative as well. I mean, you know, there's plenty of things that they can do to prioritise the arrival of a coach or a bus versus sending cars to go off and queue somewhere else. So I think there are ways of signalling to people very clearly that actually there's a really effective way of getting here and it doesn't have to be a car. And I think the other thing that I think trains have done quite well is that the journey itself becomes a really exciting and a good day out. So there's a number of train lines across the country which sort of really highlight the fact that they're going through beautiful countryside. You can just sit there and enjoy it, and it's marvellous. I mean, why don't we do a lot more of that for buses, particularly in national parks? I mean, I'd happily sit on the top deck, particularly on the front seat, and look out the window all day. I mean, it's just nothing better. And going back to the very serious point about recalcitrant local authorities, it is something that concerns me. And we have to make sure that there is appropriate carrots and sticks, which is why making sure that local leaders have the access to sharing information from other people is so important. But if they don't step up and they don't do what we would like them to do, then they simply won't get funding. And at that point, I suspect local communities might have a few things to say about it, because it is about local democracy, it is about local accountability, and it's about local services.
Thank you very much. And one thing that has improved in recent times, which we must mention because I get very excited about it, is Google Maps. You can plot any public transport route to anywhere on Google Maps on your phone. It's quite incredible. The most remote places, and you find that there actually is a connection in some way, and you can work it out, that you can never do that in the past. Chris, any more thoughts from you? And Chris, while you're speaking, if anyone has any more questions, last chance to get them up there, please do post your questions now. And Chris, any further reflections on those questions?
Thanks, Crispin. Really interesting to hear the Minister's comments in response to Ben Coulson's question there. I think that's a really important point, one that we will continue to engage on. Particularly interested in the point around national parks. for a number of reasons, because our report really tried to emphasise that not only are these rural bus services essential for rural communities themselves, it's really important that they do link up with urban communities as well, because people living in towns and cities want to be able to get out into the countryside. And not everyone can drive, and providing an alternative to driving is having an impact on the accessibility of our green space, which is so important to CPRE. So just to add really that it is absolutely essential that we do take into account these issues of national parks and trying to make as many leisure journeys as possible viable via public transport as well.
Thank you. Yes, that's a very important point. CPRE were very concerned about people being able to get out into the countryside. We've seen how important it is during the pandemic, and personally trying to get out of London into the green belt and countryside round towns and cities, you just see the way transport drops off as you leave the city boundaries. And we've got a related question on that from Emma Atkins, who works for CPRE, who's asking, because of the changes, the anticipated changes in the ways people are going to work in the future, how does the government see the role of rural bus services as people potentially move out of cities and do more home working? So any thoughts on that, Minister? Also, just want to add in as we go around, probably for the last round of batch of questions, around decarbonisation. And we've heard mention of how the bus strategy and our Every Village, Every Hour proposal is key to transport decarbonisation. But of course, the government has a transport decarbonisation plan. And how much more can be done to really integrate these two ways of thinking, so that part of the case for bus improvement is clearly aligned with the government's decarbonisation plans, and that might tip over then into spending less money on road building, more on public transport. So we've got those two questions, and one last late question coming in here, I think. Sorry, just struggling with the IT again. Where is that? No, can't see that. Let's do those two questions: decarbonisation and leisure use in rural areas, and people, particularly new ways of working. Any thoughts on those from any of the panel?
Shall I start?
Please do. Thank you.
Okay, brilliant. Yeah, no, absolutely right, in that I don't think anybody knows what's going to happen next. There's all sorts of forecasts flying around, and I know that some local authorities are looking at bus usage in other parts of the world where lockdown came out, or where they came out of lockdown much earlier, and I'm not going to lie, it doesn't look brilliant. So I think that there is quite a significant role for government and for local authorities and for operators to really come in hard when we are able to travel, to actually make sure people feel confident about returning to buses and other forms of public transport. We know that people will feel nervous, and we've got to make sure that they have as much confidence as possible. But at the moment, I think it's far too early to say, and any forecasts are necessarily going to be really, really wrong. But I do want to quickly pick up about the information point as well, because this is something we've been working on for quite a long time, in that we've done the bus open data service. So would you believe that prior to the government doing this, there wasn't a central place where you could find out the timetables, the fares, you could actually have a live bus positioning, you'd know where it was. So what we've done is actually we've had to set up our own system, which is open data, and so therefore it feeds into Google Maps, it feeds into all of the different transport apps that you can get. And I think it's going to be, it's one of the ways that we can significantly push information to people to encourage them to take public transport. So I'm really, really pleased about that. You mentioned that the government has, or the Department for Transport has, a decarbonisation plan. We don't at the moment. We're working on it. It's coming very, very soon. I think the current position is it'll be out by May. The very large, significant, overarching multimodal transport decarbonisation plan, and that will take into account obviously all different types of transport. And I've heard a lot today about, well, slash money on road building, it's terrible. Buses use roads as well. Freight uses roads. Freight is absolutely critical to our nation. The strategic road network is something like 3% of all roads, and it takes 66% of freight. You cannot suddenly just turn around and say roads are bad, can't do anything about it. And also much of what people don't understand is much of the money that we spent on roads is actually for maintenance and operation. So we are very clear that there is a balance to be had, and I completely accept that within that decarbonisation agenda, we do have to look very clearly about roads. But if every car was an electric vehicle, would that change people's opinion about whether or not road building is good or bad? So I think there's some very careful balances to be had, and I think that we do need to make sure that carbon is at the heart of what we do. So I'd encourage you to look out for the decarbonisation plan. It is a huge amount of work is going on at the moment, and of course buses will be a key part of that, along with modal shift.
Thank you, Minister, and we won't get into the road building debate now, but of course we are in favour of maintenance of roads. It's the new build that is the issue. But while I've got you, just one quick question that has come through from John Lambert, who's chair of CPRE South Yorkshire and Peak District, which is a nice constructive one. Be interested to know what you think. Would the government consider working with the local authority in one area of the country to try out CPRE's proposal of every village, every hour on a pilot basis, and we could research and evaluate it? Would that be something you consider?
I don't think it's something that central government would consider. I think if a local authority wants to pick it up and give it a go, and obviously they make a good case in their bus service improvement plan. So that's what I would do, is find a local authority that is absolutely willing to do this, get them to do a BSIP on the basis of it, make sure the BSIP complies with everything that we want it to do, and submit it to government. I mean, that would be the best way to take this forward.
OK, so we'll do it through a local authority strategy. Watch this space. We'll come back to you. Thank you. And we'll have a final round for anybody else from the panel. And we got a question from Fran Postlethwaite from the Better Buses for South Yorkshire here, who's asking, there are many groups around the country campaigning for better buses, an end to deregulation and restoration of adequate funding. Will CPRE join forces with these groups to create a strong voice for the radical change we need? Chris, that's probably one for you, and any concluding remarks while you're at it.
Thanks, Crispin. Yeah, well, that's absolutely fantastic to hear. I think we will be reaching out to as many different groups as we can to build a really strong coalition. And it's fantastic to have the support of the WI and others already, and campaigning for the reliable bus services that rural communities need to see. Yeah, and in relation to the points that have just been raised, I think it's fantastic to hear the Minister confirm that the Transport Decarbonisation Plan is on its way, and we really look forward to see how that integrates with the National Bus Strategy, because it is absolutely essential that we have the public transport alternatives to driving a car in order to make those emission cuts that we need to see. Thanks, Crispin. Thanks
very much. Annie, any reflections from you, or Steve indeed?
Well, just really the reminder that Northumberland has a huge coast, and I think we do now have a bus service that runs the length of Hadrian's Wall. Not very often, but you can just about do it, walk one way and get the bus back. And we do have a lot of walkers up here, and I think coastal, we really need buses that run up and down the coasts. That's really where the demand is.
Thank you. Anne.
Thank you. I'd like to thank the Minister for her ambition, because it has been a very positive message this morning, and I look forward to seeing a revived and good bus service in future. And I really like the idea of it being locally led, that local councils would be delivering on this and having an ambition as part of it. But including local groups is crucial. Not just the national organisations, but the local people who would be using it. We have a lot of work to do post-pandemic to get people to have the security of travelling on public transport again, not to have any fear. And I would urge the Minister not to judge the next 2 or 3 years as a success or not of this, because we are in such an unusual position as a country, and if nobody has the crystal ball that will tell us when we're going to be clear of all this. So thank you for an excellent meeting this morning. Thank you.
Thank you all very, very much indeed. Thank you to Annie Lloyd, our rural resident, and Steve, who's joined us, CPRE member from Northumberland. Thank you, of course, to Chris Hinchliff, our expert campaigner. Thank you again to Anne Jones, Vice Chair of National Federation of Women's Institute, and of course to the Minister, Baroness Vere of Norbiton. We've heard a huge amount today, but there's clearly a consensus that buses have such a great role to play in the future of our rural communities and the countryside, and there's a hell of a lot more to be done to revive them. And of course, we're not only reversing the last year, as Anne has so eloquently pointed out, of decline and disuse of public transport for very clear reasons, but actually a long-term downward spiral, going right back, dare I say, to the beaching cuts in the 1960s, when rural communities really lost their rural community, their public transport network. And we were promised then, of course, that every rail connection that was removed would be replaced by a bus. That promise, of course, has been reneged on over many decades. So it would very much welcome the confidence that the government is expressing in buses in the National Bus Strategy, the ambition and the initial tranche of money, although of course our report shows that much more is needed. But we do think that there is a long-term job to be done here, and that if you do reverse that long-term downward spiral of disuse, lack of confidence and then lack of investment, you can actually get people back on board. So to steal the phrase from the WI, the Get On Board campaign is key, but it's not just the government, it is down to all of us. When you're out in the countryside, please look for the public transport option, look on your Google map, see if you could do it in another way, and encourage everybody to do so. Please do join us on Twitter, talk about this as much as possible, get it out there. If you have any more questions that we haven't been able to answer, please do tweet us there. And apologies, of course, for the IT challenges. I always make the joke about now help yourself to coffee and cakes, but it's not just lack of coffee and cakes that we miss from face-to-face meetings. I do hope to meet you all in real life one day and not have IT challenges. So apologies for those, but thank you all very, very much for joining us. Thank you to the audience out there who I can't see, but I know you're there. And thank you again to our panel members, and have a lovely day. Thank you. Bye-bye.